The ferry's horn groaned, a sound like a dying beast, as Dean steered his truck onto the slick metal ramp. Rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the already indistinct gray of the sky and the churning water. He felt a profound weariness, a bone-deep ache that had settled in him months ago and refused to budge. This island, this remote speck on the map, was meant to be an escape, a place where the echoes of what he'd lost might finally fade into the roar of the ocean. The dock was a desolate stretch of splintered wood, barely visible through the downpour. A single figure cloaked in oilskins waved him forward with a curt gesture. This was it. The final leg of a journey that had begun with a lawyer's somber call and a will he hadn't known existed. His grandfather's cottage, a legacy he'd never anticipated from a man he'd barely known. He drove slowly, the truck's tires crunching on loose gravel, towards a small, weather-beaten shack that served as the island's border checkpoint. A single flickering fluorescent tube cast a sickly yellow glow through its grimy window. A uniformed official, stout and stoic, emerged from the shack, rain sheeting off his wide-brimmed hat. He peered at Dean through the glass, his expression unreadable, then tapped on the window. Dean rolled it down, a gust of cold, briny air rushing in. The official's face was etched with the harshness of island life, sun-scorched, wind-whipped. His eyes, the color of slate, held no warmth. "Dean Miller?" The official's voice was gravelly, carrying over the wind's howl. "That's me," Dean confirmed, his voice sounding thin against the elements. He handed over the crumpled document, a permit for entry to the private island. The official scrutinized the paper, his gaze lingering on Dean's face for a beat too long, a silent assessment that made Dean's skin prickle. It wasn't suspicion, not exactly, but something colder, more distant. A hint of knowing. Or perhaps, Dean thought, it was just the island's natural distrust of outsiders. He often felt like an outsider these days, even to himself. "The old lighthouse keeper's cottage," the official finally said, handing back the document. "It's a long road. Mind the turns and the fog." He gestured vaguely up the winding track that disappeared into the encroaching mist. "It comes in fast out here." Dean nodded, taking the permit. "Thanks." The official simply watched him, unmoving, as Dean slowly drove past the border checkpoint, the shack receding into the swirling gray. The track was narrow, barely more than 2 ruts in the overgrown grass, flanked by wind-stunted pines that clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air grew thicker, heavier, saturated with the metallic tang of salt and the damp scent of decaying vegetation. The fog, just as the official had warned, began to descend, a creeping white shroud that swallowed the landscape, reducing visibility to mere yards. It pressed against the windows, an insistent, almost palpable presence. The lighthouse. Its rhythmic flash, a slow, mournful sweep, was the only landmark in a world consumed by mist. Below it, clinging precariously to the cliff edge, was the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined and far more dilapidated. A squat, stone structure, gray and weathered, as if it had grown organically from the very rock face. The garden, if it could be called that, was a tangled wilderness of thorny bushes and tough, salt-blasted grasses. A rusty, unhinged gate hung forlornly on a single hinge. Dean pulled the truck up to the gate, killed the engine, and stepped out into the raw, biting wind. The air here felt different, heavier, laden not just with salt and damp, but with an indefinable quality that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The roar of the ocean was immense, a primal bass note beneath the shrill cries of gulls circling invisibly overhead. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. The path to the cottage was choked with weeds, the flagstones uneven and slick with moss. As he approached the front door, he noticed the paint was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing layers of faded blues and greens beneath. A tarnished brass knocker, shaped like a kraken, hung crookedly. It turned with a groan of ancient mechanisms, and the door swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing an interior steeped in gloom and the musty scent of disuse. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that penetrated the fog-obscured windows. The air inside was stale, heavy, a stagnant pool of time. He stepped over the threshold, his boots thudding on the bare wooden floorboards. He moved into the main living area, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. Old, heavy furniture draped in faded white sheets stood like ghostly sentinels. He walked to a window, pulling back a heavy, moth-eaten curtain. The glass was thick with salt spray and grime, but through it, he could just make out the swirling gray of the fog, pressing in, an opaque curtain beyond which lay only the unknown. He stood there for a long moment, watching the impenetrable mist, a profound sense of isolation washing over him. His new beginning. Then, a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible. A low, rhythmic thrumming, like something vast and heavy moving beneath the earth, or perhaps beneath the sea itself. It wasn't the waves, not exactly. It was deeper, more resonant. He held his breath, straining to hear it again over the wind's low moan. Nothing. Only the house creaking, the distant sea. He told himself it was just the old structure, settling, or the deceptive acoustics of the remote island. The silence that followed Dean past the border checkpoint was not empty, but thick with the weight of the island's isolation. The road, a narrow ribbon of crumbling asphalt, snaked through a landscape that grew increasingly desolate. Ancient gnarled trees bent by relentless wind clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. The fog, a living shroud, thickened with every mile, swallowing the distant peaks and blurring the edges of the world until only the immediate path remained visible. His truck's headlights cut weak tunnels into the swirling gray, making the journey feel endless, a descent into an indistinct void. Finally, the road ended at a steep gravel drive. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant gull and the ceaseless rhythmic boom of waves. The lighthouse, a stark sentinel of whitewashed stone, loomed through the mist, its beam cutting a slow, deliberate arc across the water. Below it, clinging to the cliff face, was the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, squat and weathered, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning sea. This was it, his new beginning, or perhaps something else entirely. He spent the first few hours moving through the cottage, a ghost in his grandfather's former life. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating forgotten relics. A brass telescope pointed uselessly at the fog-bound horizon, a collection of sea-worn buoys, charts yellowed with age. Each object felt imbued with a silent history, a weight of years spent battling the elements in the crushing solitude. The air itself held the scent of salt, damp stone, and something else, a faint, earthy musk, like old moss or upturned soil. As dusk bled into a deeper, impenetrable night, Dean found himself drawn to the windows. The tide, he noticed, was behaving strangely. It wasn't a dramatic surge, but a slow, almost imperceptible creep. The high water mark seemed to inch further up the shingle beach with each passing hour, not receding as it should have, but gaining ground, a patient, relentless advance. The water itself looked different too, not the familiar slate gray of the northern sea, but a deeper, inkier hue, reflecting no light, absorbing it instead. He tried to rationalize it. Extreme weather, perhaps. Or maybe his perception was skewed by the isolation, the sheer unfamiliarity of this remote coast. He was a cartographer, a man of precise measurements and logical explanations. Later, huddled by the small, sputtering hearth, the wind began to howl. It was a familiar sound, the lament of the sea, but tonight it carried something more. Fragments of sound, almost like words, seemed to be woven into the gale's fabric. A low, guttural murmur just at the edge of hearing seemed to weave through the fog, not quite human, not quite animal. It wasn't distinct enough to form sentences, just elongated vowels and deep, resonant hums that resonated in the very bones of the cottage. Dean dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, whistling through the ill-fitting panes and the old chimney flue. Grief and exhaustion, he reasoned, could conjure such auditory phantoms. His mind, still raw from loss, was simply overactive. He found it the next morning, tucked away in a small, damp-stained sea chest beneath a pile of oilskins in a rarely used corner of the study. It was his grandfather's journal. The leather cover was warped and stiff, scarred by what looked like brine, its pages swollen and crinkled at the edges. A faint, cloying smell, like stagnant seawater and decay, emanated from it. Dean handled it with a strange mixture of reverence and trepidation. He opened it carefully, the brittle pages resisting. The script was spidery, often illegible, but interspersed with disturbing sketches. Crude, frantic drawings of strange, elongated forms, not fish, but something more ancient, more profound. Other drawings depicted faces, not human, but with eyes too deep set, mouths too wide, etched into the rock of some unseen grotto. These weren't the whimsical doodles of a lonely man. They were urgent, desperate scrawls, imbued with a palpable fear. "It wants in." Another, scrawled across a full page, seemed a warning. Do not listen. Do not let it take root. Hallucinations, the ramblings of an old man driven mad by solitude. He closed the journal, the smell of it clinging to his hands. He had come here for solitude, for a quiet place to heal. This island, this cottage, his grandfather's legacy. They were not meant to be a descent into madness. He would unpack his maps, his drafting tools. He would focus on the tangible, the real. The acrid scent of old paper still clung to Dean's fingers, a phantom reminder of the journal he had so hastily closed. Yet the images, the half-formed phrases, they had burrowed beneath his skin. He woke feeling less rested than before. A persistent chill settled in his bones, irrespective of the fire he kept stoked. Dean's cartographer's mind, accustomed to mapping the known, now grappled with an uncharted dread. Dismissal was no longer an option. There was a logic, however twisted, to his grandfather's frantic scrawls, a rhythm that mirrored the island's own unsettling cadence. He needed answers, something concrete to anchor himself against the rising tide of his unease. His first foray into investigation led him to the island's sparse administrative hub, a collection of weather-beaten shacks near the single rickety pier. He needed to inquire about any local archives, any historical records that might shed light on the island's past. To even reach the main building, Dean had to pass through the small makeshift border checkpoint. It was little more than a wooden booth, manned by a stoic, silver-haired man who meticulously logged all movements on and off the island. Dean presented his identification, feeling the man's gaze linger a moment too long. "Looking for old stories, are we?" The man grunted, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "The island keeps its own secrets, son. Not much written down." Undeterred, Dean pressed on, eventually finding a small, dusty room crammed with forgotten ledgers and brittle maps. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten time. He spent hours poring over faded documents, records of fishing catches, lighthouse maintenance logs, and the occasional birth or death certificate. Most were mundane, but then he stumbled upon a series of old parish records, detailing strange incidents from centuries past. The texts spoke of sacrifices, not of blood, but of memory, of sanity, of a slow, creeping surrender to the will of the deep in exchange for bountiful harvests and safe passage. These were not the coherent narratives of history, but fractured fragments, hinting at something vast and terrible that lay just beyond the veil of understanding. Back in the cottage, the journal now pulsed with a new, terrifying clarity. Dean reopened it, his fingers tracing the mad lines. The pact. A silent agreement, his grandfather had written, to keep the gates sealed, to offer the tribute of forgetfulness. The sketches of the swirling patterns, previously dismissed as abstract madness, now resembled the outlines of the submerged city he'd seen in the parish records. That night, the dreams came with an unprecedented ferocity. He was falling, not through air, but through an endless column of dark, cold water. The pressure built, crushing his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Around him, colossal shapes drifted, indistinct and menacing, their forms shifting like smoke. He heard a chorus of low, guttural moans, a sound that resonated not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. The first rays of dawn were just painting the sky a bruised purple when Dean finally pushed himself out of bed. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He needed a glass of water, anything to wash away the phantom taste. He looked down, and a gasp caught in his throat. Along the grout lines of the kitchen floor, snaking from beneath the worn linoleum and creeping up the baseboards, was a network of glowing tendrils. They pulsed with a soft, ethereal blue-green light, like captured stars. Bioluminescent algae. It wasn't just on the floor. It shimmered faintly on the underside of the ancient wooden table, clinging to the legs of a chair, even a tiny patch blooming on the rim of his empty teacup from the night before. The air in the cottage, which had always smelled of salt and damp earth, now carried a faint, sweet, cloying aroma, like something blooming in the deep, something utterly alien. The algae wasn't just outside, on the rocks or in tidal pools. It was inside his cottage, growing in places where no light reached, where no moisture should have been sufficient. It was a silent, creeping invasion, a physical manifestation of the things his grandfather had warned him about, pushing their way into his reality. They were becoming real, and they were coming for him. The musty air of the forgotten room clung to Dean, a heavy cloak woven from dust and the silence of decades. His fingers, stained with the grit of ancient paper, traced the spidery script in a ledger, the words blurring under the flickering beam of his headlamp. The entries detailed fishing hauls, lighthouse lamp changes, and supplies ordered, a mundane record of a life lived by the tides. But scattered amongst the prosaic facts were unsettling deviations, cryptic annotations, strange symbols scratched in the margins, and dates circled with an aggressive, almost desperate intensity. He found one entry, dated weeks before his grandfather's disappearance, that simply read, "The barrier thins. It demands its due." A low thrum began, subtle at first, a resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his worn boots. It was too deep to be the wind, too rhythmic to be the house settling. Dean paused, pen hovering over a page, head cocked. He pushed the thought away, returning to the ledgers. As he leaned closer, a small, polished brass compass, lying open on a nearby stack of maps, slowly rotated on its own. The needle, usually twitching with the slightest movement, remained fixed, pointing north, while the entire casing spun a full 90 degrees clockwise, then stopped with a soft clink against the paper. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly to touch the cool metal. It wasn't an earthquake, wasn't a draft. It had moved with a deliberate, unnerving slowness. The thrum intensified, a deeper, more insistent hum that seemed to vibrate his teeth. He stood, pushing back from the rickety table, his gaze sweeping the room. Nothing. Yet the air felt denser, thicker, like standing underwater. He moved to a small, cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, ostensibly for a quick shave. His reflection stared back, but not quite. For a fleeting moment, the skin of his reflected face seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen current, before snapping back to normal. Dean blinked, rubbing his eyes, dismissing it as fatigue, a trick of the flickering headlamp. He found another journal, tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth. Unlike the other ledgers, this one was entirely filled with his grandfather's frantic scrawl, not neat entries, but desperate observations. It brings payment. His grandfather hadn't just been documenting a presence, he had been actively trying to appease it. The hum was now a constant, almost hypnotic drone, filling the cottage, pressing in on Dean from all sides. This door felt different, older, imbued with a sense of forbidding purpose. It was a threshold, not just of wood and metal, but of something far more profound. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped through. He felt he had crossed a border checkpoint, a literal and metaphorical line drawn between the familiar and the utterly alien. This was not just another room. It was a deeper chamber, carved into the very rock of the island, leading down into the earth. It wasn't solid, yet it had form. Vaguely humanoid, but elongated, fluid, like a figure sculpted from deep-sea brine and gloom. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow. He stumbled back, colliding with the doorframe, his mind reeling. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. It was here. It was reaching. The low thrum intensified, no longer subtle, but a deep, resonant pulse that vibrated through the very marrow of Dean's bones. It wasn't just the floorboards now. It was the air, the glass in the lantern, the metal of the grandfather's desk. His teeth ached with the sympathetic resonance, a dull, insistent pressure behind his eyes. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to steady the world that had begun to shimmer at its edges. This was no settling house, no storm surge. This was something vast and alive, humming beneath the earth, beneath the waves, a colossal engine stirring from a long, troubled sleep. He forced himself to breathe, a shallow, ragged intake of the salt-laced air. The journal lay open before him, the grandfather's looping script a frantic roadmap to this escalating dread. Dean's determination, an anchor in the swirling unease, spurred his back to the brittle pages. He traced a line with a trembling finger, a date circled repeatedly, an entry marked, "The Cycle's Turn." His grandfather hadn't just observed the island's strange phenomena. He had managed them. The language shifted, becoming less descriptive and more prescriptive. Dean's breath hitched. His grandfather wasn't merely a keeper of the light. He was a keeper of the dark. One passage, written in a hand almost illegible with haste, spoke of the requisite components and the crossing of the threshold. It included a terse, almost bureaucratic note about securing special dispensation for transit through the coastal border checkpoint, a detail that had previously struck Dean as an odd. Irrelevant aside, what kind of components required such specific regulated movement? The thought sent a fresh shiver down his spine. The ritual was not a local, isolated affair. It had tendrils reaching out, touching the mundane world, bending its rules. As Dean read, the thrum deepened, coalescing into something more defined, more insidious. It was a sound, yes, but also a sensation, a pressure against his eardrums, a vibration in the very fluid of his inner ear. He could almost discern a pattern within the low hum, a shifting cadence, like a vast, slow, guttural chant. The deep song, his grandfather had called it in one of the earlier, more poetic entries. Now, Dean understood that it was not a metaphor. The air in the cottage grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He rubbed his eyes, but the distortions persisted. The wallpaper's floral pattern seemed to pulse, its tendrils elongating, reaching. He could taste it on his tongue, a coppery tang. Was he hallucinating? The question clawed at the edges of his sanity. Fatigue, grief, isolation. These were potent solvents for the mind, but the thrumming was too real, too physical. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the journal, on the grandfather's desperate, determined scrawl. Another entry, underscored 3 times, detailed a maintenance chamber beneath the lighthouse. The anchor point, it read, where the bindings must be renewed, the tributes laid. Dean's gaze flickered from the page to the floorboards beneath him. The thrum was strongest here, directly below the desk, directly beneath his worn boots. He leaned over, pushing aside the rug, running his hand along the aged wood. One board, slightly wider than the others, felt loose. It was the smell of forgotten stone, of stagnant water, and something else. Something profoundly organic and terribly old. He peered into the blackness, unable to see anything beyond the immediate descent of rough-hewn steps. This wasn't just a cellar. It was a crypt, a maw leading into the very heart of the island's grim secret. His grandfather hadn't just lived here. He had served here. The sound had been a murmur, then a hum, then a growl in the foundations of the cottage. Now it was a roar, silent to the ear but deafening to his nervous system. He moved, driven by a determination that felt less like courage and more like an irreversible current. The lantern swung in his hand, casting frantic shadows that danced and stretched, distorting the familiar walls of the study into a grotesque carnival. The thrumming was strongest near the old stone hearth, a place he dismissed as merely decorative. He ran his hand over the rough-hewn mantle, feeling the vibrations travel up his arm, settling in his shoulder like a persistent ache. A faint seam, almost invisible, caught his eye behind a heavy, carved wooden panel beside the fireplace. It wasn't a crack from age. It was too precise, too deliberate. His grandfather, he thought, had hidden more than just journals. Dean's fingers traced the outline, the wood surprisingly warm, radiating the same low tremor. He pressed, pushed, pulled, the wood stubbornly refusing to budge. A frustration, sharp and cold, cut through his fear. He wasn't going to be stopped now, not when the answer felt so close, so tangible. He searched methodically, his gaze sweeping over the intricate carvings, the faded family crest. His fingers snagged on a small, recessed knot in the wood, barely discernible from the grain. He twisted it. A soft click echoed, swallowed almost immediately by the deeper thrum. The panel swung inward, revealing not a passage, but a narrow, unlit space. Beyond the panel lay a cramped, stone-lined corridor, descending steeply into the earth. The thrumming amplified, a physical presence now pushing against his chest. The corridor twisted, narrowing, the ceiling growing lower until he had to hunch. The thrumming became a constant, bone-jarring vibration, making his vision swim at the edges. He pushed on, his resolve hardening with every tremor. His grandfather had known. His grandfather had built this. What had he been guarding? What had he been hiding? Before him stood a formidable, iron-bound door, utterly devoid of any markings or handle. The cold air here was laced with an almost imperceptible scent of decay, not of flesh, but of something far older, something that had simply unwound. This was the border checkpoint, a heavy reinforced threshold, a final barrier between the known world and whatever lay beyond. It stood silent, unmoving, yet radiated an immense, palpable pressure, a silent challenge. Dean felt an inexplicable urge to turn back, to retreat, but the thrumming, now a relentless internal rhythm, propelled him forward. The vibrations here were so intense they numbed his hand, then his arm, then a dull ache spread through his entire side. As his hand rested on the iron, a faint, ethereal glow emanated from the door's surface, tracing intricate, forgotten symbols that pulsed in time with the deep thrum. The symbols were not of any language he knew, alien in their geometry, menacing in their silent declaration. He stepped through into a vast cavernous space. In the center of the cavern, half submerged in a shallow pool of black, viscous liquid, stood an immense obsidian monolith. It pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, a deep, bruised violet that seemed to absorb all other light. This was no mere rock. It was a heart, beating with an ancient, terrifying rhythm. The liquid in the pool stirred, mirroring the monolith's pulse. Within the depths of the black liquid, he saw movement, a slow, deliberate unfurling of something vast and formless. Tendrils, thick as an oak trunk, writhed beneath the surface, catching the violet glow. As he stared, the monolith intensified its beat. A searing mental image slammed into Dean's mind, unbidden, overwhelming. He saw the island, his cottage, the lighthouse, all of it consumed by the rising black liquid. Not a flood, but an absorption. The very stones of the island began to weep this viscous, light-devouring substance, transforming into grotesque, chitinous forms. The ocean itself turned black, a living, malevolent entity, its surface writhing with impossible shapes that broke the surface, only to dissolve and reform. The island, his refuge, was merely a stepping stone, a point of entry for something ancient and hungry to remake the world in its own image. The vision recoiled, leaving him gasping, clutching at his head. The air in the chamber felt thin, poisoned. The monolith continued its slow, resonant beat, a silent promise of the horror he had just witnessed. He understood now. This wasn't just a secret, it was a pact. And now, the gate was open. The entity, whatever it was, had been awakened, and it was reaching for him, for the island, for everything. And Dean was caught in its terrible, inevitable tide. The air felt heavy with the weight of that truth, pressing down on him, threatening to crush him before the entity even truly touched him. The violet glow of the monolith deepened, a hungry, ancient eye opening in the heart of the earth. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound was internal, a frequency lodged somewhere behind his eyes. A cold, creeping dread unfurled within him, tightening its icy tendrils around his chest. This wasn't just a phenomenon. It was an assault. It was trying to get in, to unravel him from the inside out. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow. He stumbled back from the desk, knocking a stack of old charts to the floor. The single lantern on the desk flickered violently, casting erratic, monstrous shadows that danced across the walls, making the familiar room seem alien and hostile. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the visual chaos, but the pressure in his head intensified, morphing into a sharp, piercing ache behind his left eye. It wasn't just encroaching, it was here. It was testing the boundaries, finding the weaknesses. Panic, raw and unreasoning, seized him. He was trapped, utterly alone on this desolate rock, with something vast and malevolent trying to peel back the layers of his sanity. He looked wildly around the room, his gaze landing on the leather-bound journal still open on the desk. His grandfather had battled this thing. His grandfather had known something. There had to be an answer, a reprieve, a weapon. His hands trembled as he lunged for the journal, his fingers fumbling with the stiff, brittle pages. The thrumming roared in his ears now, a relentless, deafening hum that threatened to shatter his very perception. His stomach lurched. He was at a threshold, a final, terrifying border checkpoint, where his current reality was being weighed against an encroaching alien truth. He felt scrutinized, his essence laid bare and found wanting, deemed unfit to pass into safety. The world was dissolving around him, and he was being held, suspended, judged. He forced himself to focus, the old leather smelling of dust and dried salt. He flipped through pages filled with meticulous looping script, past entries detailing the lighthouse's repairs and the weather patterns, past the increasingly frantic observations of strange lights in the deep. Then, a sudden sharp clarity cut through the haze. A section, heavily underlined, written in a hand that was almost desperate, stood out. It detailed a final, desperate measure. Not merely a ward, but a living anchor. The bloodline, the essence of the keeper given willingly. A sacrifice of freedom, of future, of self. The light must be sustained, but not just the lamp. This is not escape, but a greater imprisonment, a perpetual offering. The price of sealing the rift is the surrender of one's own existence to its guardianship. A living anchor, an eternal vigil. His grandfather hadn't just been a lighthouse keeper. He had been a prisoner, a sacrifice, a living ward against the entity. The freedom he had sought here, the fresh start, the escape from his own grief, all of it would be forfeit. He would trade one prison for another, far more insidious, far more permanent. He would become a ghost before his time, his life reduced to a single, terrible function. The thrumming lessened slightly, as if the entity sensed his discovery, his dawning comprehension. It was a terrible choice, a monstrous exchange. To save the world, or at least his small corner of it, he would have to sacrifice himself, not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, agonizing surrender of his very future, becoming a silent, forgotten guardian of the deep. The journal offered a solution, but it demanded everything. The realization had settled in Dean's bones, a glacial weight that numbed him even as the island around him thrashed. His grandfather, an anchor. The implication was a chill that seeped deeper than the relentless ocean spray, colder than the wind tearing at the cottage. This wasn't a way out, but a continuation, a transfer of burden. Outside, the storm had graduated from a mere tempest to a maelstrom of unnatural fury. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, charged and volatile. Rain lashed against the windows, not in sheets, but in solid hammering waves that threatened to shatter the old glass. The wind shrieked, a sound less like rushing air and more like a chorus of tormented voices, tearing at the cottage's very foundations. He could hear the groaning of the ancient timbers, the frantic flapping of what remained of the lighthouse's tattered flag. He moved through the cottage, a phantom in his own home. Every surface felt slick with an invisible moisture, and the air tasted metallic, like ozone mixed with something briny and rotten. The old wood of the floorboards, usually dry and creaky, now felt spongy underfoot, as if saturated from within. Patches of luminous pale green moss had begun to bloom on the walls, spreading with terrifying speed, pulsing faintly in the dim light. It wasn't just the weather. The island itself was succumbing, twisting into something alien. Dean clutched the journal, its pages brittle beneath his fingers. His grandfather's precise script, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock him with its stark clarity. He had pored over the final entries again and again, searching for an alternative, a loophole, anything that didn't lead to this inescapable conclusion. But there was nothing. The counter-ritual was clear, its instructions precise, its requirements absolute. He reread the passage, his eyes tracing the faded ink. To bind the eye, one must become the sight. The sacrifice is not of blood, but of self. He knew the place. It wasn't a man-made structure, but a natural formation on the island's treacherous western edge. A narrow, jagged chasm carved by millennia of erosion, where the cliffs plunged abruptly into a perpetually churning maelstrom of water. Locals, in hushed tones, spoke of it as the gullet, a place where the island seemed to gasp, a point of no return. The journal described it as the precise locus where the entity's influence was strongest, where the veil between worlds was thinnest. The reveal struck him with the force of a physical blow. His grandfather hadn't just performed the ritual to contain the entity, he had performed it to become the containment. He hadn't just kept the lighthouse, he was the lighthouse. His consciousness woven into the very fabric of the island, a human barrier against the deep. Dean now understood the profound personal cost mentioned in the journal. It wasn't death he faced, but something far more insidious. An eternal dissolution, his individual self slowly fading into the island's being, an unending conscious vigil. His mind, his memories, his very identity would become part of the land, a sentient anchor, forever standing guard. A tremor ran through the cottage, shaking dust from the ceiling beams. The entity was pushing, its psychic pressure a physical weight in the air, a deafening hum that vibrated in Dean's skull. He could feel its hunger, a vast, ancient emptiness that threatened to swallow not just the island, but the entire world. It wasn't merely attempting to break free. It was reaching, its tendrils of influence stretching, distorting reality. He looked at the small, crude map his grandfather had sketched in the journal's final pages, marking the path to the gullet, the border checkpoint. The lines were stark, almost desperate. He traced the route with a trembling finger, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. There was no escape, no alternative. The choice had been made for him the moment he stepped onto this island, the moment he inherited this desolate place and its unspeakable burden. He gathered the few items the journal specified for the counter-ritual. A small, smooth stone from the island's highest peak, a vial of his own blood, and a handful of dried sea salt. Each item felt impossibly heavy in his hand, imbued with a terrible significance. He had lost so much already: his wife, his future, his peace. What more could he lose? Only himself. And perhaps, in doing so, he could save everything else. He pulled on his thickest oilskins, the rough fabric a meager shield against the storm's fury. The wind howled through the gaps in the doorframe, a mournful, hungry sound. He took one last look around the cottage, his eyes lingering on the maps scattered across his desk, the cartographer's tools lying unused. They were relics of a life that was now irrevocably gone. He was no longer a cartographer. He was a sentinel. With a deep, shuddering breath, Dean pushed open the heavy oak door. The world outside was a swirling vortex of gray and white, the air thick with mist and the stinging spray of the ocean. The ground beneath his boots felt unstable, as if the island itself was shifting, groaning under the immense, unseen pressure. The border checkpoint awaited. The jagged chasm, the island's brutal border checkpoint, was behind him, a gaping maw that swallowed the light. Dean had left its precipice with a resolve that felt less like courage and more like the cold, hard certainty of a man walking to his own execution. The air grew heavier with each step toward the lighthouse, thick with the scent of brine and something else. A metallic tang, like old blood mixed with ozone, that pressed against his sinuses. The fog, a living shroud, writhed around him, its tendrils snaking across the rocky path, obscuring the familiar landscape into a shapeless, menacing tableau. The sound of the sea, usually a comforting roar, had become a distorted symphony of groans and wet, guttural exhalations, as if the ocean itself was struggling against an unseen leviathan. He imagined the unseen depths churning, ancient currents twisting into impossible knots, the very bedrock groaning under an unimaginable weight. The lighthouse, when it finally pierced the swirling gray, was not a beacon of hope, but a monolithic shadow, its lamp dark, its structure appearing impossibly tall, unnaturally slender, as if stretched by an invisible hand. He pushed open the heavy iron door at the lighthouse's base. It groaned, a sound like a dying beast, and then slammed shut behind him with a resonant boom that echoed up the winding staircase, sealing him inside. The beam from his lantern carved a tremulous path through it, revealing the spiraling steps, wet and coated in a fine, silty grime that crunched under his boots. The ascent was a battle against unseen forces. The air grew denser, pressing in on his chest, making each breath a ragged gasp. He heard clicks and scrapes from above, from below, from all sides. a cacophony of impossible sounds that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the lighthouse. He felt the entity's probing tendrils, not physical, but mental, slipping into the unguarded corridors of his mind, dredging up images of his deepest loss, the face of his beloved, twisted by agony, by the unyielding grip of the sea. Grief, raw and agonizing, threatened to buckle his knees, to consume him whole. He reached the lamp room, the circular chamber at the very top. Moonlight, pale and sickly, bled through the thick, grimy glass, illuminating a scene of disarray. Papers were scattered, maps unfurled and torn, instruments toppled. In the center, a crude, almost primordial altar had been fashioned from driftwood and ancient barnacle-encrusted stones. Upon it rested a single tarnished silver locket, his grandfather's, the one Dean had found in the cottage, the one containing a faded photograph of a woman he didn't recognize, his eyes wide with a familiar, haunted fear. This was it, the focal point. As he stepped towards the altar, the air crackled, and a low, resonant hum filled the chamber, vibrating through his teeth, through his very skull. The moonlight through the glass twisted, warping, then coalesced into a shimmering obsidian pool on the floor directly beneath the altar. From its depths, a form began to rise. It was here, fully manifested. He fumbled in his pocket for the last item his grandfather's journal had described. A small, smooth river stone, etched with a single archaic symbol. The journal had spoken of a pact, an agreement made long ago by the islanders to appease the entity, to keep it dormant. But the pact had been broken, the true cost forgotten, until now. The ritual wasn't just about sealing it away. It was about feeding it, giving it what it craved, to buy the world another century of peace. It craved memory. Specifically, the memory of profound, irreversible loss. And Dean, in his raw, unyielding sorrow, was a banquet. His grandfather hadn't sealed it. He had only delayed the inevitable, knowing a future generation, one steeped in a specific, potent grief, would be forced to make the ultimate sacrifice. The locket, the river stone, the island's ley lines. They were merely conduits. Dean himself was the offering. The entity's presence intensified, its formless mass expanding, filling the room, pressing against his very being. It was a tempting offer, a release. He lifted the river stone, his hand trembling, but his gaze fixed on the locket on the altar. He looked at the faded photograph in the locket, the unknown woman's eyes, and understood. He placed the river stone onto the locket, the symbol aligning perfectly with an unseen groove. The hum intensified to a shriek. He closed his eyes, bracing himself. He focused on his loss, on the agonizing, beautiful memory of his beloved, the last echo of her laughter, the warmth of her hand. He opened himself to the entity, a conduit of pure, unadulterated grief, offering it everything he had left. Dean's legs, numb from the trek, carried him forward as if on their own accord. The wind, a relentless tormentor, whipped his coat around him, snatching at his breath. He had left the border checkpoint behind, a jagged scar in the earth that now felt miles away, swallowed by the oppressive gloom. His destination was the lighthouse, its beam a distant, wavering pulse against the impenetrable fog, a final, desperate beacon. The deep song. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical presence, a pressure in his skull, a slow, insistent burrowing. He stumbled onto the rocky outcrop leading to the lighthouse's base, the spray from the churning waves lashing his face. The structure loomed, a skeletal finger against the bruised sky, its glass eye sweeping the tumult. The door, usually a stubborn beast of warped wood and rusted iron, hung ajar, groaning on its hinges, inviting him into the gaping maw of its interior. Inside, the silence was a sudden, jarring blow, thicker and heavier than the outside cacophony. No wind, no spray, only the rhythmic thump-thump of the lamp mechanism above. A mechanical heartbeat. It wasn't a language, not in any way he understood, but a primal, ancient intonation that twisted his insides. He reached the lamp room, the circular chamber where his grandfather had spent countless nights. The light cast its sweeping rhythm, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and a sight that made his breath catch in his throat. The center of the room was not empty. A pool of black, viscous liquid, impossibly still and reflective, pulsed faintly on the stone floor. It didn't reflect the lamp's beam, instead absorbing it into its depths. It was the deep song given form, the entity finally showing itself. He understood then. The pact wasn't to seal it away, not entirely. It was a tether, a conduit. His grandfather had been its anchor, keeping it contained, preventing its full emergence. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon for ships, it was a cage, and the lamp a constant, blinding pressure. And now, with his grandfather gone, the tether was fraying. The entity was reaching out, not just for the island, but for a new anchor, for him. A wave of vertigo slammed into Dean, the room spinning, the deep song screaming in his mind. He felt a pull, a sickening suction, as if his very essence was being drawn into the black pool. He staggered back, his hand fumbling for the switch of the lamp mechanism. This was it, the only way. His grandfather's journal, tucked into his inner coat pocket, felt heavy, a leaden weight. He remembered the last cryptic entry. The light must never falter. It is the eye that sees, and the shield that binds. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Dean fought the encroaching pull. He slammed his palm against the emergency override. The lamp mechanism, with a groan of stressed gears, shuddered. The sweeping light intensified, becoming a blinding, unblinking glare that filled the entire chamber. The black pool recoiled, its tendrils of mist shrieking, dissolving into nothingness. The formless shape within its depths convulsed, a silent agony rippling through its surface. The pool itself began to shrink, to recede, as if being sucked back into the earth. It left behind only a damp, black stain on the stone floor, like a fresh bruise. The air cleared, the metallic tang replaced by the clean scent of ozone after a storm. Dean stood there, gasping, leaning heavily against the railing, his body trembling uncontrollably. The immediate threat was neutralized. The entity was pushed back, sealed for now. But the cost. He felt it settle over him, heavy as a shroud. The deep song had burrowed into him, not just a sound, but a memory. A resonance. He could still feel the faint thrum beneath his skin, a constant low vibration that would never truly leave him. He walked to the window, staring out at the turbulent sea, the fog still thick, but less menacing now. He was free, perhaps. He could leave. The launch was still at the dock, waiting. And it had left its mark. He was no longer just Dean, the reclusive cartographer. He was the one who knew. The island had claimed him, not as a prisoner in stone and iron, but as a vessel. He was the new guardian, whether he wanted the role or not. He would be waiting,